Thanks for the introduction. Yes, my name's Karin Fogarty, and today this is my PhD proposal, where I'll be discussing the economic valuation of different post-mine land uses, the case study of an open-cut coal mine for the Central Tablelands of New South Wales. So who am I? Yes, this is me standing in rehabilitation. So I am the epitome of a coal miner's daughter, having grown up in Blackwater. For those who know Blackwater, it's commonly referred to the coal capital of Australia. So my dad was a dragline operator for 25 years there, and so he created the mess that's synonymous with mining. And so that's where I established an interest in mine site rehabilitation. But after a career in state and local governments, I re-educated myself and went back to university before entering the coal industry. So for the last 8 years, until January this year, I've been employed in Queensland and New South Wales, working across in the coal industry. So that's working across 3 different sites there. So I was primarily responsible for the rehabilitation, biodiversity offsets and mine closure for those 3 operations. So I was the doer on site. So my role was predominantly to make sure that rehabilitation got done in accordance with the obligations of the legislation. And it was all about trying to make sure that we were on track to get the rehabilitation and the site mining lease signed off as early as we can so we could get our bond back. I'm not going to lie, that was probably the primary role there on site. I just want to make the classification that I'm not an economist by background. My background is environmental science. So Wilpinjong Coal Mine, so this is where I'm from, and this is where the case study is being performed. So it's an existing open-cut coal mine operation. It's about 40 kilometres away from Mudgee, which is, oh, I get to use my stick, which is about 4.5 hours directly west of Sydney. It sits just outside of the Hunter Valley region, which is what's probably the most well-known coal mining district of New South Wales. It produces 16 million tonne of thermal coal. It's got a 70-30 split with that, so 70% actually supplies the domestic coal the electricity market, and the rest goes overseas. It's a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week operation, employs about 500 people on a good day, and it's about 3,000 hectares in size. And it's one of currently 3 operating coal mines in the Mudgee mining district. The mining method also is truck and shovel, essentially. So this is a bit about the mining process directly. So this is just, again, a little bit of background information. So generally with mining, they go through and do the veg clearance, then you'll come through and do topsoil stripping, overburden removal, so that's what's happening there. Drill and blasting, then they'll remove the coal. They'll also dump the overburden back onto the landform behind the advancing face. And then you've got rehabilitation. So effectively what rehabilitation is they'll reshape the waste dumps and then put a thin veneer of topsoil on top, and I'm talking 10 to 15 centimetres of topsoil, and then spread the seed out, and that's how you achieve your rehabilitation. So mining wastes are also deposited back into pit via tailings dam and also coal rejects, which are the coarser rejects. So this here is actually a picture of Wilpinjong Coal Mine. So as you can see, Wilpinjong is not a typical coal mine, or what I would refer to as a typical coal mine. It has a very shallow reserve, so you end up with this type of landform. So in some places the wombats have actually dug out the coal, so it makes it one of the cheapest coal mines to operate in Australia. It's got a stripping ratio of about 1.3 to 1. So, Steve, did you have a question?
It ends up looking nearly like a box site.
It does in this particular picture. There are other areas where, because the way that you mine, you have to end up with a higher landform in some locations, but in this particular valley, it does.
It's surface mining.
Yeah, yeah. And you can also see here, so this is pre-disturbance. That's what Wilpinjong typically looked like. So it was it's cleared agricultural land. So it's acknowledged that mining is a temporary land use. there is a responsibility for companies to minimise disturbance, create those stable non-polluting landforms and carry out progressive rehabilitation. And in all states of Australia, mining companies are also regulated to rehabilitate their disturbance to a condition that is capable of supporting a post-mine land use. And the post-mine land use is essentially describing the overall goal of the rehabilitation and the mine closure process. But how do you make that decision? So in my experience, it's complicated. It's bloody complicated, I should say. The decision demands an assessment of both positive and negative options, which consider the stakeholder expectations as well as acceptance by the regulators and the physical and landscape restrictions. The aim should be to ensure that the post-mine land use is optimal from a social welfare perspective. For example, some attributes that you might consider, is climate, soil type, regulators, community expectations, even the regional planning side of things. So, for example, you wouldn't nominate growing a rainforest in the middle of outback Queensland where it doesn't support the soil doesn't support that land the ecosystem or the rainfall, for example, and the community probably don't bloody want it either. So the other side of that, so there are consequences to the decisions when, some of these decisions, and they're primarily the the time that it takes to create or achieve those objectives. For example, creating a speedway track versus creating, like Alcoa have to do the Jarrah Forest, which I think they allocate about 30 years, compared to a speedway track that might be developed within a year. The other side of that is the cost side of things. So, for example, you can equate or quantify the costs by understanding, what equipment we're going to use, what species we may need to purchase, what contractors, or the length of time we need to employ those contractors. So you can quantify those costs, and you can do that because they're in a market situation. But what about all the benefits from the post-mine land use? For example, grazing you can quantify because you can sell the cattle, so you'll be able to quantify those costs. But what about the non-market values that rehabilitation create? For example, recreation values or ecosystem services, for example. So presently we just don't really understand what those non-market benefits of rehab are, as research examples worldwide are limited, but I'll get into that a little bit later. And additionally, within Queensland and New South Wales, there's currently no legislative requirement to consider those non-market values when making the post-mine land use decision. So this here, I just wanted to demonstrate, this is basically the approval process in New South Wales, and the post-mine land use decision is made up here in the assessment phase. That's all I wanted to make that point. So some examples in New South Wales of post-mine land uses include grazing. So this is a Rio Tinto, it was a Rio Tinto, it's now a Yancoal site in the Hunter. Biodiversity values, so this is Mangoola, another open cut coal mine. This is tourism. This is Peak Hill Gold Mine, not far from home. This one, which one's come up? Oh, that one. Browns Creek, which is a gold mine, is a composting production site. So they're accessing the water plus other minerals there on site to create the composting for agricultural purposes. This one's for James, which is a waste deposit bioreactor. So that's at Woodlawn. So that's an old mine that they're now using those services for. So internationally, this is from Germany. This is a shaft head frame now turned into a commercial enterprise. How about this one? So this is Wales. This is an old underground slate mine. So they've turned this into a trampolining, I'd say extreme trampolining place. I don't know if I'd get on that one. They're from a series of tunnels. You can rope tunnels. You add all the different levels. Not for me. This one is probably the most famous example internationally, which is Eden Project, and that's in England. That's an old clay mine. So they've created these biodomes, and they've got different ecosystems within those biodomes, and they've created tourism and education examples there. And finally, this one's from America. This is just one of their examples. They've set these up on a series of their mines, but this is, some aesthetic artwork built into their rehab design. So they'll actually grass over the top of those. And finally, this is probably my favourite one, which is Kingston Gold Mine. This is actually an Australian example, but this is in northwest Queensland. Why I like this one, this is going to be a world first solar and pumped hydroelectricity hybrid project. So essentially they're going to pump water from that one there down here and they'll create electricity in the process. But why I like this one, this was an abandoned site for a number of years and now they're value adding to that site by undertaking this project. And they're also using the infrastructure. So they're using the roads that were there. There's an old camp that was there that's now going to be reutilised. And, mining brings infrastructure. And they're going to utilise all that infrastructure. So they're value adding. So a bit of background about Wilpinjong. So this is the Wilpinjong Post-mine land use. So this was, it was granted in 2005. You'll see two different colours on there and they mean two different things. So essentially the post-mine land use was sustainable agriculture and biodiversity. So these beigey areas were for effectively grazing, so they were going to put cows on it. And these green areas were the biodiversity corridors because there's a national park, Goulburn Park National Park to the north and Munghorn Gap Nature Reserve to the south. So effectively they were going to create those corridors through the mine. And this is effectively what it looked like, well, it looks like on site. Again, the grazing area, cows sort of give it away, and the woodland areas, which are the biodiversity corridors. This is what it looks like now. So in 2017, they've had a change in their approval process. They've had an extension, so all of this is new, and some other little bits and pieces around the bottom. So they've undertaken an extension project and now they've changed their post-mine land use. So the post-mine land use now is conservation.
Sorry, who changed the post-mine land use?
Well, through the approval process, the mine the Wilpinjong Coal Mine now has an approval to generate their post-mine land use back to conservation. So through that process, Wilpinjong, they were quite happy. When they've gone through the approval process, they were happy to continue with what they were doing, which was the grazing and biodiversity. However, the regulators encouraged Peabody to change their post-mine land use to conservation. So it's not what Peabody wanted, it's not what the community wanted, but this is what we've got because they wanted their approvals. So as a result, 3,000 hectares now will be changed back to trees, effectively, including the 400 hectares of rehabilitation that was undertaken. That all has to get reworked now to meet this new criteria because it doesn't contain the right species in it. So when I say that, the vegetation type, don't pay too much attention, but these are the different vegetation that they now have to create on site. And why that is for the Regent honeyeater, which is a critically endangered under both the New South Wales legislation and the Commonwealth EBPC Act. Wilpinjong does receive credits under the biobanking scheme for this. However, if they've got triggers under 5 and 10 years, and if they can't show that their rehab's on a trajectory of meeting these, they'll have to go and buy offsets somewhere else to quantify for this figure, and still rehab the site as well. So me being the doer on site, the person I went, I understood the consequences to these decisions and the challenges that we were going to face, especially because some of these vegetation communities actually didn't even grow on the mine in the first place. They may have been in the area, but it's all about supporting the birds. So these are the veg communities that support the birds. So like I said, me being the doer on site, started questioning the why factor, mainly around the cost and the time factor that I talked about before, and which led me to start to look at some research options. So some of the questions that I thought about was, well, what is the best post-mine land use option for Wilpinjong from a social welfare perspective? What is best for the Mudgee community? Should alternatives be investigated that consider future generations? For example, looking at some of those slides we looked at earlier. What are the economic benefits and values created when completing the rehabilitation for the different post-mine land uses? And what are the contributing factors as to why non-market valuation techniques aren't currently being used? Like I said before, Queensland and New South Wales don't recognise them in their decision-making process. So, which brings on to the research aims. Improve evidence-based decision-making of mine site rehabilitation objectives and determining the post-mine land use options. Increase understanding of non-market values and costs of different post-mine land uses. And add to the policy discussion on the use of the non-market values in the decision-making process. So the overall objective of this project is to critically assess the environmental benefits and costs of the alternative post-mine land uses at Wilpinjong Coal, and to determine essentially the economic, socially acceptable and the environmentally responsible option. So this is research objective 1. I think we can all relate to that little diagram there, but essentially it's the review and scene setting. So it's about So the objective is to undertake an overview of the current knowledge, so get a feel for where we are on the evaluation methods and the decision-making process of the post-mine land use options in the coal mining industry in New South Wales. And how I'm going to go about doing that is the lit review, which I'm just finishing off now, to look at the relevant research of non-market studies, identify the current evaluation and decision-making methods that are currently being used to determine the post-mine land uses, discuss if these methods embrace ESD principles, in the factor, are they considering future generations when they make their decisions, discuss examples of other post-mine land uses, and the last two are about getting prepared, I suppose, for the next step, which is identifying who our stakeholders are in this discussion, as well as identifying the current regulatory and legal framework. So it's no use doing something if we're not allowed to do it anyway. So objective number 2 is to complete that non-market valuation study to determine the values and associated monetary values of those different post-mine land use options. So that's to complete the proposed steps is to undertake some workshops and identify the attributes that people want to consider in a choice modelling survey. So that is the technique that we're going to undertake. So obviously once you've got that, we've got to go through and do the design of the survey, complete the survey, and then analyse the data. It's all quite straightforward. Number 3 is estimate the actual costs associated with the development of different post-mine land uses. So in New South Wales, and I think most states actually in Australia, they've got rates calculators that you have to use to work out your bonds anyway. So rather than me go and try and make up data, I'll just use those rates calculator, so then it's fair and transparent in those cost calculations as well. So it's about identifying those different costs for those different post-mine land uses. And then number 4 is to integrate those costs and benefits that we've identified in the previous steps into a cost-benefit analysis. And the review, and so finally with that we can review and compare the results of each of those post-mine land uses and determine which post-mine land use provides the highest net benefits. And finally, research objective 5 is to investigate and assess the contributing factors as to why economic valuation techniques aren't currently being used. So how I'm thinking at this stage to go about doing that is to review the mining policies in New South Wales and see if they align with ESD principles, and more specifically the economic valuation of the post-mine land uses. Complete some interviews or some workshops perhaps with some regulators. There's other industry groups in New South Wales that I used to be affiliated with, so the New South Wales Minerals Council, and also talking to other industry members. And also at the moment there's some reforms in most states of Australia. They've all gone through their rehabilitation reform process. New South Wales is currently still going through theirs. And also there's, in the Commonwealth, they're actually undertaking a Senate inquiry so the Commonwealth can understand what their obligations are in relation to mine rehabilitation as well. So there's lots of public interest at the moment, so which leads to the next slide. Like I said, there's significant public interest on mine rehab at the moment. So the current policy discussion includes investigating pathways to these alternative post-mine land uses, and in particular New South Wales has identified in their discussion paper that they've released for rehab reform that they're seeking comment on at the moment, is that there's no justification provided as to why companies are actually choosing their post-mine land use, so there's no evidence to support why they're saying, why they're nominating those post-mine land uses. So that's something that the government has identified, so hopefully this research can also add to that policy discussion as well. So research contribution, so the next couple of slides just a summary about current research that's been undertaken. So the first category I sort of looked at was estimating the non-market values of environmental, cultural and social features of mining. So this isn't particular to rehabilitation, this is mining in general. Results indicate that there's only been 12 studies and 6 of those are from Australia. So in New South Wales, two-choice modelling valuations have been undertaken to estimate those non-market impacts of 2 coal mines. These include Gillespie and Crack. Did I pronounce that right? No. Sorry. Marret and Gillespie and Bennett. So they were both undertaken in 2012. So both studies require trade-offs between positive and negative impacts, as well as environmental and social impacts. So both studies' results indicated respondents' willingness to pay to avoid impact of Aboriginal sites and ensure employment benefits over a number of years. Additionally, they also measured willingness to pay to avoid impacts on waterways and swamps, which was in the case with Marret, and the endangered ecological communities and rural communities, which was what Gillespie and Bennett's looked at. In Queensland, primarily all the research is undertaken by Central Queensland University, so that's of Vannevar, Rolfe and Windle. So they've undertaken 3 studies there, and they predominantly look at the social impact, although in 2 of their studies they did look at minimal environmental impacts as well. So they looked at their latest one, which was in 2015. Their study identified, sorry, that's Rolfe and Windle. In 2015, their study looked at how Queensland's largest population, which is Brisbane, viewed the potential economic, social and environmental impacts of rapid resource development in the Surat Basin. So that was gas and, that's coal seam gas and coal mining. So the results of that study indicated that there can be significant community concerns for those impacts in other communities. And Vannevar and Rolfe in 2011 undertook a study in Moranbah, again primarily looking at the social impacts, but they did also measure willingness to pay for the mine coming closer to Moranbah. So through that study, as expected, they were less likely to choose scenarios that came at a higher cost, and they preferred those no additional impacts for the mine with noise, vibration and dust impacts as well. There are a couple of international studies as well. I'll only touch on a couple. Spice et al. In 2012, they also undertook choice modelling to assess respondents' willingness to pay for some development impacts in southeast Yukon in Canada. Why I like this one is what you think is important is not necessarily what other people think is important. So they assessed where this study was undertaken, it was mainly Aboriginal population. So their attributes looked at jobs, density of moose populations on the landscape, daily fish rates and the population in the region. So I found that one interesting. And finally, men Doncia et al. In 2000. These guys were the first ones to do a contingent valuation in a developing nation. So they looked at the impacts of mining in the Amazon. And I found that one interesting because, again, they come from mainly a poor and uneducated population. So they also commented on their survey development and how important it is to factor that in when they do it. So again, I thought that was good. So again, limited studies in that side of, so mining in general, and these are even more limited. So this here is the so this is estimating the non-market values and environmental, cultural and social features of mine rehabilitation. So in this particular search, there's only 7 studies that I could identify and only 1 in Australia. And that one here in Australia was undertaken by Michael and Ben, and they specifically analysed the preferences of different approaches and attributes for mine site rehab using choice experiments again. Here the purpose of the study was to estimate dollar values held by the public for the rehab at Alcoa. So their rehab strategy at Alcoa is to reinstate the Jarrah forests, which are similar to the surrounding area. Results indicated that plant species richness is important, along with the habitat recreation, introduction of threatened fauna species, and reducing the completion time of the rehab process. So again, limited studies, but a couple internationally, which include, so that one there is Alcoa, and these two here are from a site in Spain. So this was the latest example I can find. So this was published in 2016. This is by Perez Aves et al. And they completed a travel cost method to look at the value of this mine site as a recreation site. So they looked at the geological features of the mine as well as the heritage value. So as you can see, it used to be an underground mine, so all these geological features have now part of a tourism site. There's also been a couple done over in Germany, and they've looked at one in particular is Leenhoop and Messner in 2009, and they also did a contingent valuation, and they looked at the benefits of post-mining Lake District in East Germany by measuring the recreation values. So the results of that study influenced water allocations in the particular area because they were surrounded by agriculture. So this was a way that they could value the water that was entering the mine site. So the research, my research contribution, so the gaps in knowledge that I've identified to date, is that there are no assessments of post-mine land use options to ensure that is optimal from a social welfare perspective. So this will demonstrate a usefulness of economic valuation research to industry, add significant research to the academic community, being the first to integrate detailed mining industry rehabilitation knowledge with economic cost-benefit analysis. And it's obviously new academic knowledge for choice experiments to articulate the attributes of post-mine land use relevant to both industry and community members. Any questions? Thank you.